Welcome back to the deep dive. We are doing something a little different today. Usually when we try to understand the history of America, specifically that really explosive period of growth between the Civil War and the Great Depression, we tend to look at it through the great men lens.
Right.
We look at the treaties, the laws, the biographies of presidents, the shifting borders.
Which gives you the top-down view, sure. It gives you the structure. But it completely misses the texture of actual daily life. It misses the smell and the taste of history.
Exactly. So today, we are flipping the camera. We are going to look at the history of America not through a war map, but through a dinner plate. We are working through a really incredible stack of research centered on Jane Ziegelman's book, 97 Orchard.
Fantastic book.
I've seen it described as an edible archive, which I think is just the coolest concept.
It really is. It's a fantastic concept. What Ziegelman does is she takes one specific tenement building on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, 97 Orchard Street, and she uses it as a lens to view the entire immigrant experience. So we aren't just talking about immigration as this, broad, abstract demographic shift. We are zooming in on 5 specific families who actually lived in this building between 1863 and 1935.
It grounds the history so well. We're basically covering the age of migration, right?
Precisely. This is that window where you have massive chunks of humanity streaming from the countryside of Europe into the cities and then eventually across the Atlantic to the United States. And when they landed, they didn't land in mansions. They landed in places like 97 Orchard.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the lives of 3 specific families who lived in this building. The Glockners, who were German, the Moores, who were Irish, and the Gumpertzes, who were German-Jewish.
A great cross-section.
And we want to uncover how they used food, not just to, keep from starving, but to navigate this incredible hostile new world. We want to see how they used dinner to assimilate, and eventually how they completely revolutionized the American palate.
It's essentially the origin story of how we eat today. But before we can even, knock on their doors, we have to understand the stage itself. We have to talk about the building.
Right.
97 Orchard wasn't just a container for these people. It was a machine that dictated how they lived and, crucially, how they cooked.
And the notes describe 97 Orchard as being a cut above for its time. It was built by a fellow immigrant, a guy named Lucas Glockner.
Right. Glockner is a fascinating character study all on his own. He was a German tailor originally, but he had that classic 19th century entrepreneurial instinct. He capitalized on the housing boom of the 1860s.
So he saw an opportunity.
A huge one. The records actually show his evolution in real time. He goes from being listed as a tradesman to being a gentleman. That is literally what he called himself in the census once he grew this big bushy mustache and became a landlord.
Living the American dream.
Exactly. And because he lived there himself, he built 97 Orchard with some genuine flair. It wasn't a slum when it was built. It had painted ceilings, it had fancy moldings in the hallways, it had style.
But flair doesn't equal function. And the source material highlights one glaring, massive omission that changes everything about daily life. Indoor plumbing.
That is the single most important fact about cooking in a tenement. Ziegelman calls it the human freight elevator, and I think that's the perfect term. We have to really visualize this to understand the food we're going to talk about.
Okay, so paint the picture.
If you wanted to boil a potato, you didn't just walk over to a sink and turn a tap.
Right, you had to work for it.
You had to grab a bucket, walk down 4 flights of narrow, unlit wooden stairs, go to the backyard pump, fill that bucket with water, which weighs over 8 pounds a gallon, and then haul it all the way back up those 4 flights of stairs.
Oh my God. And we aren't talking about a single glass of water here. We're talking gallons and gallons for laundry, for bathing the kids, for scrubbing the floors.
And for cooking dinner. And that's not even mentioning the coal and the wood you had to haul up to keep the stove running. It turned the housewives into beasts of burden. The physical calorie burn just to prepare to cook was immense, and that physical reality strictly dictated the menu.
How so?
Well, if every drop of water costs you back-breaking labor to acquire, and then you have to haul the dirty water back down to dump it, you are not going to cook a meal that requires 3 different pots that all need washing.
You're going to look for efficiency.
Ruthless efficiency. You are going to make one-pot meals. You are going to make stews. The architecture of the building literally shaped the recipes of the residents.
So keeping that image of the water bucket in mind, let's walk up those stairs and look at the first family on our list, the Glockners. They were German, and they arrived from the Lower East Side, was known as Kleindeutschland.
Little Germany.
Little Germany.
The Glockners really represent that small space, big flavor dynamic. As we touched on, the lack of plumbing meant the German housewives became masters of the stew. But I don't want people to think of this as some bland, gray, utilitarian sludge. They brought a very sophisticated, established palate with them.
I was struck by the complexity of the dishes mentioned in the sources. They talk about Hasenpfeffer.
Which is a wild rabbit stew.
Right. But it's the flavor profiles that seem surprisingly high-end for a tenement kitchen. There's a mention of cooking veal with dried pears.
That sweet-savory combination is very traditional in German cuisine going back to the Middle Ages. Fruit was a way to add depth, sugar, and calories to a meat dish. But the real aha moment here, the thing that separates the Glockners from just generic poor immigrants, is their use of condiments.
The spiced vinegar.
Exactly. This wasn't just vinegar, it was an emotional anchor in a bottle. The recipe is wild. It's vinegar steeped with garlic, mace, horseradish, and get this, 60 whole walnuts.
60 walnuts.
In the shell.
In the shell. You would steep them in the jar until the walnuts turned black and the vinegar became this thick, pungent, dark, spicy sauce. It was almost like a German Tabasco.
You sprinkle a few drops of that on your rabbit stew, and suddenly the smell transports you. You aren't in a dark, airless room in Manhattan anymore. You're back in Baden or Bavaria. It was a sensory escape hatch.
Speaking of sensory experiences, if we are talking about a German tenement, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, or rather the smell in the hallway. Sauerkraut.
You literally couldn't escape it. The sources are very vivid about this. They talk about the smell of sauerkraut blooming in the winter. It permeated the walls, the clothes, the bedding. Everything smelled like fermenting cabbage.
And this wasn't just, buying a jar of sauerkraut at the grocery store. This was an industrial production taking place inside the home.
It was a harvest ritual. In the fall, cabbage was cheap and plentiful, so you'd have these itinerant tradesmen called Krauthoblers, literally cabbage shavers, who would go door to door in the tenement districts.
I love that this was a specific job description. Hi, I'm your neighborhood Krauthobler.
It required specialized tools. They carried these massive wooden mandolins to shred the cabbage uniformly. The housewives would buy bushels of cabbage, the Krautobler would shave it down, and then the whole family would get involved, salting it, pounding it into barrels layer by layer until the brine rose over the top.
So it was a whole process.
An essential one. It was the only source of vitamin C they would have during the winter. It prevented scurvy.
There's another character mentioned in the research regarding sauerkraut that I wish still existed today.
Yeah.
The sauerkraut man.
The night vendor. This is such a great detail of city life. He would roam the saloons late at night. The description is fantastic. He wore a white apron and carried a specialized pewter box.
Okay.
This box was actually pretty high-tech for the 1860s. It had hot water jackets, heated compartments to keep the frankfurters and the sauerkraut steaming hot, and then a separate cool compartment for potato salad.
So he's basically a walking 7-Eleven. You're sitting in a saloon drinking your beer, and this guy walks in with hot dogs and kraut.
It was the perfect business model, and it pairs perfectly with the other massive German contribution to American life, lager beer.
This is a crucial distinction in the research. Americans were already drinking alcohol before the Germans arrived. We had plenty of whiskey and ale.
Right.
But the Germans changed the game. What is the technical difference that matters here?
It's biology and chemistry. Before the Germans, Americans drank English-style ales. Ales are top fermented. They brew at warmer temperatures. They are heavy, darker, higher in alcohol, and they are often drunk at room temperature.
Right, a warm, dark beer.
The Germans brought lager yeast, which is bottom fermented and needs cold storage. Lagern actually means to store or to rest in German. The result is something crisp, golden, carbonated, and served cold.
And the sources argue that this switch from ale to lager actually changed the sociology of drinking in America.
Drastically. The pre-German American style of drinking was go to a bar, stand up at the rail, drink whiskey or heavy ale to get drunk as fast as possible, maybe get into a fight, and then leave. It was rough, it was male only, and it was seen as a vice.
But the Germans.
The Germans viewed beer as liquid bread. It was nutritional and it was social. They introduced the beer garden, which completely shocked the American Puritans. We're talking about places like the Atlantic Gardens on the Bowery.
The scale of that place sounds insane. The notes say it could hold 3,000 people.
3,000 people. Imagine a space that big in 1870s New York. Frescoed ceilings, orchestras playing Viennese waltzes, and the most scandalous part for the Americans observing this, There were women and children there.
Wow.
You'd have entire families sitting at long tables listening to Mozart, the parents drinking lager, babies crawling on the floor. It introduced the concept of civilized leisure to the American working class.
It normalized alcohol as a domestic staple, too. The kids were even involved in the distribution. The growler.
Right, the tin pail was a standard chore. Hans, run down to the saloon and fill the growler. Kids would haul buckets of beer back up to the tenement for dinner. It wasn't seen as something to hide, it was just dinner.
So the Germans gave us lager, the hot dog, the concept of a family restaurant. But looking at the notes, their impact on the actual American lunch seems even more foundational.
Oh, absolutely. The German lunchrooms introduced the hamburger steak. The source has a great quote describing it as beef redeemed from toughness by being chopped up. It made meat affordable and chewable for the working man.
And bread. We can't forget the bread.
The state of American bread before the Germans arrived was apparently tragic. One critic in the notes called it slightly compressed white smoke.
White smoke.
It was chemical-leavened, flavorless stuff.
Enter Louis Fleischmann.
An Austrian officer turned baker. He introduces Vienna bread at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. It's yeast-leavened, crisp-crusted, dense. People went crazy for it.
And this is the same Fleischmann?
The very same. His yeast packets are in your fridge today. He industrialized the production of quality yeast.
And with that yeast came the sweets. The coffee cake.
Kuchen. The idea of having a sweet, yeast-raised cake with your morning coffee is a direct import from these German bakers. We take it for granted now, but that combo sweet cake, bitter coffee, is a German gift to the American morning.
It's amazing how the foreign elements, the Frankfurter, the burger, the lager, the coffee cake, became the most stereotypical American symbols.
That's the pattern we're going to see over and over, assimilation via the stomach.
So that's the Glockners. Now, I want to shift gears and walk down the hall to the Moore family. They were Irish. And reading through their section, the tone changes completely.
It does.
If the German story is about bringing a rich, confident culture to America, the Irish story feels like it starts from a place of deprivation.
It starts with trauma. You cannot understand the Irish diet or the Irish-American diet of this era without understanding the Great Hunger. We need to look at the numbers because they are staggering. Before the famine, the average adult male in Ireland was eating 12 pounds of potatoes a day.
12 pounds.
Yeah.
Every single day. I can't even visualize that pile of food.
It was a monoculture. The potato was the only thing that grew densely enough on tiny plots of land to feed a family. It provided almost all their calories. So when the blight hit in the 1840s, this fungus that turned the potatoes into black, oozing slime overnight, it wasn't just a bad harvest. It was the total collapse of their biological fuel source.
And the cruel irony, which the book points out, was that Ireland was still producing food during the famine.
Massive amounts of it. Beef, pork, grain, but it was all for export. The source mentions the pig, which the Irish peasantry called the gentleman who pays the rent.
The gentleman who pays the rent.
You raised the pig, you fed the pig, but you never ever ate the pig. You sold it to pay the English landlord so you wouldn't get evicted.
So you have families like the Moores, Joseph and Bridget, arriving in New York. They are young, often single, and they are essentially culinary blank slates because they've never had access to ingredients.
Exactly. Bridget Moore came over at 17, Joseph at 20. They are fleeing starvation. And this leads to a really interesting dynamic in how they learned to cook. For many Irish women, their culinary school was the American kitchen.
Because they went into domestic service.
Right. The Bridgets, as they were collectively called, they worked as maids and cooks in wealthy American homes. The sources are full of complaints from American mistresses about these raw servants who didn't know how to light a coal stove or how to make a pudding.
So they were looked down upon.
Oh, completely. But the flip side is, these women were absorbing American foodways. They learned to roast large cuts of meat, bake pies, make gravies, things they never saw in Ireland.
So when Bridget Moore eventually marries Joseph and sets up her own home at 97 Orchard, she isn't cooking Irish food. She's cooking a working-class version of upper-class American food.
It's a hybrid. But for the men, or the single workers who didn't have a Bridget to cook for them, the food scene was the boarding house. And this is where we get the culture of hash.
Hash seems like the ultimate efficiency food.
It's the art of leftovers. Sunday's corned beef becomes Monday's hash. The sources highlight a specific dish called fish hash. It was salt cod, potatoes, and pork scraps, all fried together in a pan. It's dense, salty, calorie-heavy fuel for manual laborers.
And washed down with tea. The doctors of the time seemed really worried about Irish women and tea. They called them tea inebriates.
It sounds ridiculous now, but it was a genuine public health panic. You had these Irish women drinking huge quantities of tea that was boiled until it was black and then loaded with sugar. But if you look at their lives, it makes perfect sense.
It's a stimulant.
Exactly. It's caffeine to get you through a 14-hour workday, and the sugar is a quick hit of energy. Plus, hot, sweet liquid suppresses hunger. If you can't afford a full meal, a cup of extremely sugary tea tricks your stomach into thinking it's full. It was a survival mechanism.
Now, we have to address the St. Patrick's Day elephant, corned beef and cabbage. The notes say this is effectively a myth.
It's an Irish-American invention, not an Irish tradition. In Ireland, corned beef, which is salt-cured beef, was a luxury product produced for the British Navy or for colonies in the Caribbean. The Irish peasant couldn't afford to eat it. They ate potatoes, maybe some bacon or salt pork if they were lucky.
So why did it become the icon here?
Because in America, beef was relatively cheap. For an Irish immigrant, buying a piece of beef was a massive status flex. It was saying, I have arrived, I can eat the meat I used to watch get loaded onto ships for someone else.
It's reclaimed luxury.
Exactly. And pop culture solidified it. The source points to the famous comic strip bringing up Father Jiggs and Maggie. Jiggs is the rich Irish American who just wants his simple corned beef and cabbage, while his wife Maggie wants to eat fancy French food.
I know that one.
That strip, along with places like Dinty Moore's restaurant in Midtown, turned corned beef into the ultimate symbol of Irish success.
One last Irish staple that surprised me. Oysters. Today, oysters are fancy. You go to a raw bar, it's $4 a pop. But back then,
They were the Big Mac of the 19th century, the great equalizer. The New York harbor was literally paved with oyster beds. You could get all-you-can-eat oysters for pennies.
all you can eat, and the patty man.
The patty man is my favorite example of lost fast food. In the Irish lunchrooms, you'd have a guy whose only job was making oyster patties. These were puff pastry shells filled with chopped oysters in a cream sauce or gravy. He'd churn them out by the hundreds. It was grab-and-go food for the working man.
It's wild to think of oysters as filler food.
It shows how relative value is. Scarcity defines luxury. Once the pollution killed the oyster beds, they became expensive. But for the Moors, they were cheap protein.
All right, let's move to our third family, the Gumpertzes. They were German Jewish. This adds a whole new layer of complexity to our deep dive because for them, food wasn't just about survival or status, it was about law.
The kosher dilemma. Natalie Gumpertz is the head of this household. She's a tragic, resilient figure. Her husband disappeared during the financial panic of 1873, leaving her to raise the kids alone in the tenement.
So she was on her own.
Completely. And for her, maintaining a kosher kitchen in a building with no plumbing was a logistical nightmare.
Right, because to keep kosher, you have to separate meat and milk. Separate
Yeah.
dishes, separate cleaning.
In a 300-square-foot apartment, it required immense dedication. But they did it. The week revolved around the Sabbath, Friday night, and the centerpiece of that meal was fish.
Specifically, gefilte fish. Now, I grew up thinking gefilte fish was just those gray, rubbery balls floating in a jar of jelly. But the real version described in the book sounds completely different.
The jarred stuff is a sad echo of the original. Gefilte implies stuffed. Originally, this dish was a piece of culinary taxidermy.
Culinary taxidermy, that is a phrase. Explain that.
The housewife would take a whole carp. She would slice it open and carefully scrape the meat out without tearing the skin, which is incredibly difficult to do. She'd chop the meat with onions, eggs, matzo meal, and seasonings. Then she would stuff that mixture back into the skin and sew it up so it looked like a whole swimming fish again.
That sounds like an insane amount of work for a Friday night dinner.
Yeah.
Why go to all that trouble?
Symbolism and economy. Symbolically, the fish represents the Leviathan, the great sea monster that the righteous are promised to feast on in the world to come. It was a holy dish. But economically, by stuffing it with breadcrumbs and onions, you could stretch one expensive fish to feed a large family.
The notes also mention the gefilte line, the sugar versus pepper war.
This is the classic intra-Jewish battle. The Galicianas Jews from Poland and Austria put sugar in their fish. They liked it sweet. The Litvaks from Lithuania and the north used pepper and savory spices. You could literally map someone's ancestry by tasting their fish. It was an edible map of Eastern Europe.
But the Gumpertzes were German Jews. And the German Jews in New York at this time were in a unique position. They were assimilating faster than the Eastern Europeans. They wanted to be American.
And this tension is perfectly captured in one of the most shocking sources in our stack, Aunt Babette's cookbook. It was published in 1889.
It's the Jewish cookbook. But I'm looking at the recipe list here and I'm confused.
It's startling.
Right. There are recipes for oysters, for ham, for rabbit. These are all forbidden foods.
It's effectively a treif cookbook. It was aimed at the Reform Jewish community. The argument was, we are modern Americans now. Those old dietary laws are archaic tribal customs. As long as the food is clean and healthy, it's fine.
That is a huge departure.
Huge. Aunt Babette even suggests wrapping a sore throat in strips of raw bacon as a cure.
You're kidding. That is a very specific medical opinion. I can't imagine that was FDA approved.
Probably not. But it shows the desperate desire to fit in. Americans ate oysters, so modern Jews wanted to eat oysters. But they still tried to bridge the gap. That's where you get the oyster noodle kugel.
That recipe stopped me in my tracks. Noodle kugel is a sacred Sabbath dish. Sweet noodles, eggs, cinnamon. Adding oysters to it feels like a violation.
It's the ultimate confusion on a plate. It's taking the form of the tradition, the kugel, and stuffing it with the ultimate symbol of assimilation, the oyster. It captures the identity crisis perfectly.
Did they have any justification for this? Or did they just ignore the rules?
Oh, people love a loophole. There were actual debates where people argued that oysters were actually plants because they didn't move, or that the shell counted as a scale, so therefore it was a fish.
Wow.
The human ability to rationalize eating something delicious is boundless.
We can't talk about the Jewish Lower East Side without hitting the street scene. Hester Street.
The pushcart market. It was sensory overload, and the foods that dominated were the ones that survived without refrigeration. This is the empire of the pickle and the herring.
The pickle barrel.
Essential. It was a palate cleanser, it was a snack, it was a vegetable that didn't rot, and the herring barrels of salt herring. It was the cheapest protein available. You knew you were in the Jewish quarter just by the smell of brine and vinegar. It marked the territory.
So, stepping back for a moment, we have these three families living in 97 Orchard, the Glockners with their beer and stews, the Moores with their hash and tea, the Gumpertzes with their gefilte fish and confused oyster kugels.
Right.
They're all living on top of each other.
Literally breathing the same air, smelling each other's cooking in the hallways. And that proximity is the key. They aren't isolated in ghettos, they are mixing.
So what is the legacy here? How do these three distinct threads weave into what we eat now?
Well, look at the functions they contributed. The Germans taught Americans how to eat. They brought the joy, the leisure, the family dining experience. They civilized the act of public eating with beer garden and the restaurant culture.
And the Irish?
The Irish fueled the machine. They were the ones in the kitchens actually doing the cooking in the hotels and the homes. They provided the heavy caloric protein, the meat and potatoes that built the skyscrapers and railroads. They made the workforce run.
And the Jewish influence.
They were the bridge. They showed how to adapt ancient traditions to modern abundance. They gave us the bagel, the pastrami, the deli culture. But more importantly, they dramatized that struggle of assimilation, the fight between who I was and who I am becoming, played out right there on the dinner table.
It is fascinating that today, if I eat a bagel for breakfast, a hamburger for lunch, and corned beef for dinner, I'm not eating ethnic food. I'm just eating American food.
That's the trajectory. It goes from suspicious foreign slop to exotic novelty to national staple. 97 Orchard is the laboratory where that alchemy happened.
So here's a thought to leave you with. If the sauerkraut and the oysters of the 1860s were the weird foods that became classics, what is happening right now?
That is the question. We are living through the next chapter of 97 Orchard right now. Think about the foods that some people find too spicy or too funky today. Maybe it's fermented kimchi or insect protein or very specific regional dishes from the global south.
The strange lunch of today is the American classic of 2090.
Absolutely. We just don't know which dish is going to win the assimilation lottery yet.
So next time you open your pantry, take a look at a jar of pickles or a box of spaghetti or a bag of coffee. Ask yourself, how far did this travel? And who carried it up the stairs?
It's usually a much longer journey than you think.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.